Rain soaked straight through Claire's cheap canvas sneakers. She didn't care. Being fired after back-to-back trauma shifts had a way of numbing the cold. All she wanted was the sagging cushions of her living room couch. Then the roaring engines drowned out the thunderstorm. 5 matte black SUVs swerved violently across the wet asphalt, boxing her against a brick wall. Doors slammed. Men in tailored suits stepped into the downpour, heavy weapons hanging at their sides. A man stepped forward, desperation bleeding through his lethal calm. "Where's the nurse?" The fluorescent lights in the Human Resources office buzzed with a sound that reminded Claire of a failing heart monitor. "It's a matter of liability, Claire. You understand." Administrator Davis sat across the faux mahogany desk, folding her manicured hands over a manila folder. She wore a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. Claire stared at the folder. Inside was her termination paperwork. 9 years. 9 years of missed holidays. 12-hour shifts that bled into 16. Cold coffee, and the metallic smell of blood that never quite washed out of her cuticles. Gone, because she had done her job too well. Protocol dictates that only an attending physician can authorize a thoracostomy, Davis said, her voice dropping into a practiced, soothing register. "Dr. Weber is the attending. You overstepped." Dr. Weber froze, Claire said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the hysterics Davis was clearly braced for. The patient had a tension pneumothorax. His trachea was deviating. His oxygen was dropping in the 60s. If I hadn't decompressed his chest, he would have coded in 2 minutes. Dr. Weber was staring at the wall. "That is your perspective," Davis countered smoothly. "Dr. Weber's report states you acted erratically and physically shoved him aside. The hospital board cannot tolerate rogue nursing staff. We are offering you 2 weeks of severance. If you sign the non-disclosure agreement." Claire didn't argue. There was no point. The hospital was a machine built on billing codes and malpractice insurance. Saving a life was secondary to filling out the right forms. She picked up the plastic pen, signed her name on the dotted line, and walked out. The walk from the administrative wing to the staff locker room felt like miles. Nurses she had trained averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by clipboards and medication carts. Word traveled fast in the ER. She opened her locker. The metal door groaned on its hinges. She dumped her spare scrubs, a half-eaten box of granola bars, and a heavily taped stethoscope into a plastic grocery bag. She left the St. Jude's Memorial Hospital lanyard hanging on the hook. It looked like a noose. Outside, the sky had cracked open. Rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, turning the Chicago streets into a grey, blurred mess. Claire stood under the hospital awning, watching the water rush into the clogged storm drains. Her car, a 10-year-old sedan with a failing alternator, was currently sitting in a mechanic's lot a mile away. She couldn't afford the repairs yesterday. With 2 weeks of severance pay to her name, she definitely couldn't afford them today. She pulled the collar of her oversized denim jacket up to her ears, gripped her plastic bag, and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her immediately, biting through her thin cotton shirt. Within seconds, her hair was plastered to her skull. She walked east, away from the sterile, brightly lit medical district, and toward the gritty industrial neighborhood where her apartment sat above a failing laundromat. Cars sped past, their tires hissing on the wet asphalt, spraying dirty puddle water against her jeans. Claire kept her head down. She didn't cry. The exhaustion was too heavy for tears. She calculated her rent, the cost of groceries, the dwindling numbers in her checking account. She wondered if the free clinic downtown was hiring. They paid minimum wage, but they didn't care if you offended a legacy doctor's fragile ego. The streetlights flickered, fighting a losing battle against the encroaching dusk. The sidewalks emptied out. Normal people were inside, drinking warm tea, watching the rain from the safety of their living rooms. Claire was alone, on a stretch of concrete, flanked by abandoned warehouses and chain-link fences. Her sneakers squelched with every step. The plastic grocery bag handle snapped, dropping her stethoscope onto the wet sidewalk. Claire stopped. She stared at the medical instrument lying in the dirty water. For a brief, overwhelming second, the weight of the last 24 hours threatened to crush her. She crouched down, her knees popping in the cold, and picked it up, wiping the grime off the bell with her thumb. A low, guttural vibration rattled the puddle at her feet. Claire looked up. The sound wasn't thunder, it was an engine, several of them. High performance, heavy, and moving fast. Through the curtain of rain, headlights cut through the gloom. They didn't pass her. They slowed. Claire's breath hitched. City instincts kicked in. You don't linger on a dark street when cars slow down. She stuffed the stethoscope into her pocket, clutched her torn plastic bag, and quickened her pace, turning her body towards the narrow alleyway between two brick factories. Tires screeched. The smell of burning rubber mixed violently with the scent of wet asphalt. Before Claire could reach the shadow of the alley, a massive matte black SUV swerved directly onto the sidewalk, blocking her path. The heavy grille of the car stopped inches from her knees. Claire stumbled backward, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She spun around to run back the way she came. A second SUV skidded to a halt behind her. Then a third, a fourth, and a fifth, boxing her in completely. The headlights blinded her, casting long, erratic shadows against the brick walls. They idled with a menacing, synchronized purr. She was trapped. The heavy thud of car doors opening cut through the sound of the rain. Men stepped out of the SUVs. They didn't look like muggers. They wore dark, tailored wool suits that absorbed the rain without losing their sharp lines. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace. None of them spoke. None of them yelled. They simply formed a perimeter around Claire, their hands resting naturally near their waistbands. The sheer lack of panic in their movements terrified her more than a drawn gun would have. Claire backed up against the wet brick wall, the rough stone biting into her shoulder blades. She dropped the plastic bag. Her spare scrubs spilled into the mud. From the lead SUV, a man emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying authority. The headlights caught the sharp, uncompromising angles of his jaw and the dark, wet hair plastered to his forehead. He wore a charcoal suit, but his tie was missing, and his white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. As he stepped closer, Claire saw the dark, heavy stains soaking his cuffs. Blood. A lot of it. He didn't look at her. He didn't even register her as a human being. He looked past her, scanning the empty street, the dark alley, the chain-link fence. His chest heaved once, a massive intake of air that betrayed a frantic, barely controlled adrenaline. "Where is she?" he demanded. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel grinding against steel. It wasn't a question. It was a threat. The man to his left, slightly younger with a nasty scar cutting through his eyebrow, stepped forward. "Tracker said her phone was right here, Dominic. Pings right to this block." Dominic's eyes snapped to Claire. They were a pale, icy grey, completely devoid of warmth. He looked at her soaking wet jacket, her muddy jeans, the pathetic plastic bag at her feet. He looked at her like she was an obstacle in his path. "Where's the nurse?" Dominic barked. He took a step closer, towering over her. The heat radiating off his body was palpable in the freezing rain. "The one from St. Jude's. She walked this route." Claire's mind raced. They had tracked her phone. They knew where she worked. They were looking for a nurse. The nurse. "I don't have money," Claire said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to keep it steady. Dominic's jaw clenched. He pulled a heavy, matte-black handgun from his holster in one fluid motion, not pointing it at her, but holding it at his side in a way that promised violence if he didn't get his answer. "I didn't ask for your wallet," Dominic said, his patience instantly vaporizing. "A trauma nurse left the hospital 20 minutes ago. Short hair, blue scrubs, tracked her phone to this exact spot." Where did she go? He didn't recognize her. She was wearing a bulky denim jacket over a plain white t-shirt, completely drowning her frame. Her hair was a matted, wet mess. She looked like a vagrant, not the highly competent medical professional they were hunting. Claire looked at the blood on Dominic's hands. It was fresh, arterial red. She looked at the idling SUV he had stepped out of. Through the tinted, rain-streaked window, she saw a hand pressed against the glass, a bloody hand sliding downward. The fear in her chest abruptly shifted. The panic subsided, replaced by the cold, clinical detachment she relied on in the trauma bay. A switch flipped in her brain. Blood meant a patient meant a problem to solve. "What kind of injury?" Claire asked. Her voice dropped to the tremor. It was flat, commanding. Dominic blinked, the question catching him off guard. His icy eyes narrowed. "What? The blood on your cuffs is bright red, meaning it's highly oxygenated. An arterial bleed," Claire said, stepping away from the brick wall. She wasn't looking at his gun anymore. She was looking at the car. "Based on the volume on your shirt, whoever is in that car is hypervolemic and going into shock. You have about 4 minutes before his brain starts dying." "What kind of injury?" The scarred man stepped forward, his hand dropping to his weapon. "Who the hell are you?" Claire reached into her pocket. Half the men in the perimeter drew their guns, the metallic clicks of safeties disengaging, cutting through the rain. She didn't flinch. She pulled out the wet stethoscope and let it hang from her fingers. "I'm the nurse," Claire said. "And I just got fired. So unless you have a portable OR in the back of that Tahoe, your friend is going to die on that leather upholstery." Dominic stared at her for a fraction of a second. He processed the information with terrifying speed. He didn't ask for her credentials. He didn't ask her name. He turned and yanked open the heavy rear door of the SUV. "Fix him," Dominic ordered. Claire stepped forward and looked inside. A man in his early 20s was sprawled across the back seat. His suit jacket was shredded. A dark pool of blood was steadily expanding across the floorboards. His face was the color of wet ash. 2 gunshot wounds to the right thigh, high up, close to the femoral artery. Someone had tied a makeshift tourniquet out of a leather belt, but it was sloppy, placed too low to stop the bleeding effectively. "He needs a hospital," Claire said, leaning into the cab. "He can't go to a hospital," Dominic said, pressing his heavy hand against her back, effectively pushing her into the vehicle. "Cops are waiting at every ER in a 10-mile radius. You saved a guy this morning at St. Jude's. Weber's patient. Word on the street is you're the one who kept him breathing, not the doctor." "Do it again." "I have no supplies," Claire snapped, pushing back against him. "I can't stop a femoral bleed with my bare hands." Dominic reached into the trunk space and threw a massive, military-grade trauma kit onto the seat next to the dying man. It was fully stocked. Gauze, quick clot, hemostats, IV bags. "You have supplies now," Dominic said, his voice lowering to a deadly whisper. He slammed the car door shut behind her, trapping her inside the warm, blood-scented cabin. The engine revved, throwing her forward as the SUV accelerated violently into the night. The SUV took a corner at 60 miles an hour. Centrifugal force slammed Claire against the passenger door. Her shoulder hit the reinforced glass with a dull thud, but she didn't have time to feel it. The man bleeding out on the leather seats groaned, a wet, terrible sound that clawed at the quiet luxury of the cabin. Claire scrambled to her knees. The plush floor mats were already soaked, squelching under her wet sneakers. The metallic smell of copper filled the enclosed space, thick and suffocating, competing with the scent of expensive cologne and damp wool. She dragged the heavy canvas trauma bag onto her lap. Turn on the dome light. Now. In the front passenger seat, Dominic twisted around. He hit a button on the overhead console. The cabin flooded with harsh, yellow light. It illuminated the absolute carnage in the back seat. The victim was younger than Claire first thought. Maybe 22. His face was devoid of color, his lips tinged with a faint, terrifying blue. Sweat plastered his dirty blonde hair to his forehead. His eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites. "Hey," Claire said. She slapped his cheek, hard. "Hey, look at me." His head lolled, but his pupils dragged downward, struggling to focus on her. "What's his name?" Claire yelled over the roar of the engine. "Tommy," Dominic said. His voice was dangerously calm, a stark contrast to the frantic speed of the vehicle. He watched her every move, his icy grey eyes tracking her hands. "Can you fix him?" "I can keep him from dying right this second," Claire snapped. "Which is a lot more than your belt was doing." She grabbed a pair of trauma shears from the side pocket of the military kit. She didn't bother trying to unbuckle his ruined trousers. She hooked the blade under the thick fabric of his suit pants and ripped upward, shearing through the expensive wool and cotton in one violent motion. The injury was a mess. 2 bullet holes. 1 entry, 1 exit. The entry wound was small, a neat little puncture on the outer thigh. The exit wound, halfway up the inner thigh, was catastrophic. The bullet had tumbled, tearing through muscle and nicking the femoral artery on its way out. Bright, oxygenated blood pulsed in a steady, terrifying rhythm. The leather belt someone had tied around his leg was sitting 3 inches too low. It was acting as a venous tourniquet, trapping the blood in the leg and making the arterial bleed worse. "You're killing him with this," Claire said. She didn't wait for permission. She unbuckled the soaked leather belt and threw it onto the floorboards. The immediate release of pressure caused a fresh geyser of blood to erupt from the wound. It splashed across Claire's white t-shirt, warm and sticky. Tommy screamed. It was a raw, primal sound that bounced off the soundproofed windows. He thrashed, his hands clawing weakly at the seats. "Hold him down," Claire ordered. Dominic didn't hesitate. He climbed over the center console with terrifying agility, his massive frame filling the cramped space in the back. He pinned Tommy's shoulders to the seat, using his forearm to press the younger man's chest down. The sheer physical strength required to immobilize a thrashing body looked effortless for him. "Do it," Dominic growled, not looking at Tommy, but staring directly at Claire. Claire dug into the kit. She bypassed the standard gauze and pulled out a packet of combat hemostatic dressing, the kind impregnated with a clotting agent that burned like hell but stopped massive hemorrhage. She tore the plastic with her teeth, spitting the wrapper onto the floor. "Tommy, this is going to hurt," Claire said, her voice dropping into the calm, authoritative cadence she used in the ER. "Scream if you need to, but do not move your leg." She didn't give him time to process. She shoved her fingers directly into the exit wound. Tommy arched off the seat, a guttural roar tearing through his throat. Dominic's arm clamped down harder, an immovable iron bar across his chest. Claire felt the slick, torn edges of muscle. She found the source of the pulsing blood with her index finger and pressed down hard against the femur bone, clamping the artery manually. The bleeding slowed to a sluggish weep. "Got it," she breathed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. But her hands were completely steady. This was her element. The chaos, the blood, the ticking clock. This made sense to her. Administrative meetings and HR protocols were alien territory. This was pure mechanics, plumbing with a pulse. Using her free hand, she began packing the hemostatic gauze into the wound channel, feeding it in inch by bloody inch, pushing it directly against the artery. "You're doing fine, Tommy." "Stay with me," Claire murmured. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she kept talking. The sound of her own voice grounded her. She packed the last of the gauze into the torn flesh. "I need pressure on this. Both hands. Hard as you can." She looked up at Dominic. He didn't argue. He shifted his weight, releasing Tommy's chest and moving his large, blood-stained hands over the packed wound. "Push down," Claire instructed. "Like you're trying to touch the bone through the skin. Don't let up for 3 minutes." Dominic applied his weight. His jaw was clenched, a muscle ticking violently in his cheek. For the first time, Claire saw a fracture in his icy exterior. It wasn't panic, it was rage. A cold, calculated fury simmering just beneath the surface. He wasn't looking at Tommy's wound. He was looking out the blacked-out window, his mind already calculating retaliation. Claire wiped her bloody hands on her wet jeans. She rummaged through the bag, pulling out a genuine cat tourniquet. She slipped it high up on Tommy's thigh, right near the groin, and pulled the strap tight. She twisted the windlass rod once, twice, 3 times, until the pressure completely cut off the remaining arterial flow. She locked the rod into the clip. "Time is 8:14, Claire muttered to herself, pulling a black Sharpie from her pocket and writing the time directly on Tommy's pale forehead. It was standard military protocol. It told the next surgeon exactly how long the limb had been starved of blood. She checked his radial pulse. It was thready, incredibly fast, but it was there. "He's stable for transit," Claire said, falling back against the door panel. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She looked down at her hands. They were stained crimson up to the wrists. Her clothes were ruined. She was sitting in a stolen car with a mob boss and a dying man. Dominic kept his hands pressed to the wound. He finally looked at her. Really looked at her. "What's your name?" he asked. The gravel in his voice had smoothed out, replaced by something heavier. "Claire." "You did good, Claire." "He still needs a surgeon," she said flatly, refusing to acknowledge the strange, heavy tension in the small space. "He lost at least 2 liters. He needs a transfusion, a vascular surgeon to repair the artery, and massive antibiotics. A tourniquet buys you a few hours, not a cure." "We're 3 minutes away," Dominic said. He tapped the glass, separating them from the driver. "Step on it." The engine roared in response. Claire closed her eyes, the vibrations of the road seeping into her tired bones. She was terrifyingly calm. Tomorrow, she might fall apart. But tonight, she had a patient. The convoy didn't stop at a hidden warehouse or an abandoned shipyard. The SUVs turned sharply down a narrow, rain-slicked alleyway in the meatpacking district, the tires kicking up a spray of filthy water. Concrete walls rose high on either side, blocking out the city lights. They approached a solid, corrugated steel door that looked like it hadn't been opened since the 90s. As the lead car approached, the heavy door rumbled upward, revealing a cavernous, brilliantly lit subterranean garage. The vehicles rolled inside, the tires squealing on the polished epoxy floor. The metal door slammed shut behind them with a finality that made Claire's stomach drop. They parked in a tight, synchronized formation. Before the engines even fully cut out, men were swarming the vehicles. Dominic kicked his door open. "Get the gurney! Now!" 2 men in dark clothes sprinted forward, pushing a collapsible medical cot. They yanked the back door open. "Watch his leg!" Claire barked, moving out of the way but hovering close. Keep the leg elevated. Do not touch the tourniquet." They dragged Tommy out of the blood-soaked interior. He was completely unconscious now, his skin a terrifying shade of translucent grey. They hoisted him onto the gurney. "Where is the clinic?" Claire demanded, looking at Dominic. He didn't answer. He just pointed toward a set of heavy, reinforced double doors at the far end of the garage. Claire grabbed the trauma bag and ran alongside the gurney. They burst through the double doors into a space that made Claire stop in her tracks for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a dirty back room. It was a fully functional, state-of-the-art surgical suite built directly into the concrete bunker. Stainless steel tables, overhead surgical lights, a crash cart, oxygen tanks, and an autoclave. It was cleaner than Trauma Room 3 at St. Jude's. "Move him to the table," Claire ordered, shaking off her shock. The sterile environment grounded her. It was a language she spoke fluently. They hoisted Tommy onto the steel operating table. "Get out," Claire said, looking at the two men who had pushed him. They hesitated, glancing back at Dominic, who had just walked through the doors. He was peeling off his ruined suit jacket, revealing a shoulder holster and the heavy, black weapon resting against his ribs. "You heard her," Dominic said softly. "Out." The men vanished, the heavy doors swinging shut behind them. Claire didn't waste time being intimidated by the gun. She moved to a stainless steel sink in the corner, hitting the foot pedal to start the hot water. She scrubbed her hands and arms with harsh antiseptic soap, watching the pink, diluted blood swirl down the drain. "I need IV fluids," Claire said, drying her hands on a sterile towel and snapping a pair of blue nitrile gloves onto her hands. "Lactated ringers if you have it. Normal saline if you don't. He needs volume, fast." Dominic walked over to a glass-fronted supply cabinet. He didn't look like a man who spent time organizing medical supplies, but he pulled out two heavy, 1-liter bags of lactated ringers without hesitation. "Hang them!" Claire pointed to the IV poles bracketing the table. She grabbed a 16-gauge needle from a drawer. Tommy's veins were completely flat, collapsed from the massive blood loss. It was like trying to thread a needle through a deflated balloon. She tied a rubber tourniquet around his bicep, slapping the crook of his arm to force the vein to rise. Nothing. "Come on, Tommy. Give me something," she muttered. She ran her thumb over his pale skin, feeling for the slight, spongy resistance of a vein, rather than looking for it. She found a tiny, faint line. She angled the needle and pushed. A tiny flash of dark blood appeared in the chamber. "Got it," she breathed. She slid the catheter in, taped it down securely, and attached the IV tubing. She opened the roller clamp all the way. The clear fluid rushed into his arm. She repeated the process on his other arm, establishing a second line. "He needs O-negative blood," Claire said, checking his blood pressure manually with a cuff. "Fluids will keep his heart pumping, but it won't carry oxygen. If you have a blood bank in this compound, now is the time to open it." Dominic stood on the opposite side of the steel table. He was watching her with an intense, unreadable expression. The harsh overhead lights cast deep shadows over the sharp angles of his face. "We have a guy," Dominic said slowly. "A surgeon on retainer. He was supposed to be here 10 minutes ago." "Then call him," Claire said, grabbing a pair of heavy trauma scissors and cutting the rest of Tommy's ruined clothes off, leaving him in only his boxers to check for other injuries. "Because if he doesn't get here in the next 20 minutes, you're going to have a very clean corpse on this table." He's not answering. Dominic's voice was deathly quiet. Claire stopped. She looked up from Tommy's pale, sweat-slicked chest. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier, suffocating. "What do you mean, he's not answering?" "I mean, the man paid very well to be available 24 hours a day has turned his phone off," Dominic said, stepping closer to the table. He rested his large hands on the stainless steel rim. which means he's either dead or he's been bought by the people who put those holes in Tommy. Claire stared at him. The cold reality of the situation finally pierced through her clinical detachment. She wasn't just doing a freelance trauma shift. She was standing in the middle of a war. "I am a nurse," Claire said, her voice slow and deliberate, making sure he understood the boundary. "I can stabilize, I can medicate, I can maintain an airway. I cannot perform vascular surgery. If I try to clamp and sew that femoral artery, I will shred it, and he will bleed to death in under 60 seconds. Dominic looked down at the young man on the table. Tommy's breathing was shallow, his chest barely rising. "He's my brother," Dominic said. The words hung in the sterile air, devoid of the usual frantic emotion that accompanied family members in the ER. It was stated as a simple, unchangeable fact, a fact that carried the weight of a death sentence. Dominic's icy eyes snapped back to Claire. "You kept him alive in the car. Keep him alive now." "I told you. I don't care what you can't do," Dominic interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a lethal, quiet authority. "Figure out what you can do. Because if he dies on this table, Claire, my problems become your problems." Claire stared at the gun resting against Dominic's ribs, then up at his icy, unblinking eyes. The threat hung in the sterile air, heavy and absolute. In the ER, she dealt with screaming families, violent addicts, and arrogant surgeons. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford on the clock. She took a slow, deep breath, burying the terror under a thick layer of clinical detachment. "If I try to sew that artery, he dies," Claire repeated, her voice perfectly even. "But I can bridge it. I can put a temporary vascular shunt in to restore blood flow to the leg. It buys us maybe 6 hours before the tissue starts dying for good. But I cannot do it alone. I need hands." "I have men outside," Dominic said, his hand dropping toward the door. "No." Claire pointed a gloved finger at him. "I need someone who isn't going to pass out when I open this wound. And I need someone who takes orders without asking questions. Scrub in." Dominic didn't move for a fraction of a second. The dynamic had shifted. He was the boss of whatever criminal empire funded this subterranean hospital. But in this room, over this steel table, Claire was the absolute authority. He gave a short, rigid nod, stepped up to the sink, and hit the foot pedal. Claire turned her back to him, pulling open the sterile drawers. She bypassed the delicate surgical sutures and grabbed a hard plastic tray containing pediatric supplies. She ripped open a sterile, heavy-gauge IV tube, cutting off the needle adapters with heavy shears. It was a crude, bastardized version of a Javid shunt, but it was all she had. "Put these on," Claire said, tossing a pair of sterile gloves onto the metal tray next to the sink. She moved to the head of the table, hooking Tommy up to the portable ECG monitor. The machine sprang to life, the green line tracing a frantic, erratic heartbeat. 140 beats per minute. His blood pressure was sitting at a dismal 70/40. He was hanging onto the edge of the cliff by his fingernails. Dominic stepped up to the opposite side of the table. His massive hands looked absurd, enclosed in the thin blue latex. "What do I do?" he asked. The lethal edge was gone from his voice, replaced by a tight, focused intensity. "You hold exactly what I tell you to hold, and you do not let go," Claire said. She grabbed a scalpel and a pair of steel retractors. "I have to open the wound tract to find the severed ends of the artery. It's going to be a mess. The tourniquet is staying on, so the bleeding shouldn't be catastrophic, but it won't be dry." She didn't wait for his nod. She pressed the scalpel blade into Tommy's pale thigh, slicing through the torn flesh to widen the exit wound. The muscle parted, revealing a dark, gelatinous cavity of clotted blood and shredded tissue. "Retractors," Claire said, handing him the metal instruments. "Hook them under the muscle wall on both sides. Pull back and hold it open. Hard." Dominic took the steel tools, hooked the blunt prongs into the tissue, and pulled. The wound gaped open, exposing the pale yellowish fat and the deep red of the quadriceps. "More light," Claire muttered, reaching up to adjust the overhead surgical lamps. The harsh beam illuminated the carnage. She grabbed a suction tube and began clearing the pooled blood, her eyes scanning the torn tissue. Arteries didn't look like the bright red tubes in anatomical textbooks. They looked like flat, pale rubber bands when they were empty. "There," Claire breathed. She spotted the distal end, the lower half of the severed femoral artery. It had retracted into the muscle bed, a natural defense mechanism. She grabbed a pair of DeBakey forceps, delicate and serrated, and pinched the slippery vessel, pulling it gently upward. "I need you to clamp this," Claire said, handing Dominic a bulldog clamp. "Right below my forceps. Pinch it tight." Dominic's hands were remarkably steady. He placed the small metal clamp exactly where she indicated, locking it into place. "Halfway there," Claire said, sweat beading under her plastic face shield. "Now for the hard part." Finding the proximal end, the side connected to the heart, was dangerous. It was sitting directly under the tourniquet pressure. She dug deeper into the muscle bed near the groin. "I'm going to loosen the tourniquet slightly to look for the pulse. It's going to bleed. Do not let go of those retractors." Claire reached up with her left hand, twisting the windlass rod on the tourniquet back a quarter turn. Instantly, a jet of bright crimson blood shot upward, hitting Claire squarely in the chest. Dominic tensed, his knuckles turning white around the steel retractors, but he didn't move an inch. "Got you," Claire said, ignoring the warm blood soaking through her shirt. She jammed her forceps into the wound, clamping down hard on the pulsing vessel. "Tighten the tourniquet. Now." Dominic let go of one retractor with his right hand, reached up, and wrenched the black rod tight, locking it back into the plastic clip. The geyser stopped, reducing to a manageable weep. Claire exhaled a shaky breath. She held the top half of the artery in her forceps. "Give me the plastic tubing." She took the makeshift shunt and carefully threaded one end into the bottom half of the artery, tying it securely into place with thick silk suture. She took the other end and slid it into the top half, tying it off just as tight. It looked like a clear plastic bridge connecting two raw, pale pipes. "Okay," Claire whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. We release the tourniquet. If the ties hold, the blood routes through the plastic. If they don't, we're back to square one, but with less blood in his body. She didn't look at Dominic. She reached up and unclipped the tourniquet, slowly loosening the strap. They both stared at the wound. The pale, empty plastic tube suddenly flashed crimson. Dark, oxygenated blood rushed through the makeshift shunt, bypassing the torn tissue and flowing down into Tommy's lower leg. The ties held. There was no leaking, no geyser. The ICG monitor beeped. The frantic rhythm began to slow. 130, 120, 110. Claire checked Tommy's foot. The skin, previously cold and grey, was slowly blooming with a faint, pinkish hue. Capillary refill was returning. She let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding since she left the HR office. "He has a leg. For now." The silence in the operating room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the heart monitor. Claire stepped back from the surgical table, her knees suddenly feeling like they were made of damp sand. The adrenaline that had sharpened her focus to a razor's edge was evaporating, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her hands, completely steady while holding the scalpel, now trembled violently. She stripped off the bloody latex gloves, the snap sounding loud in the quiet room, and tossed them into a red biohazard bin. Her clothes were heavy, soaked through with rain, sweat, and Tommy's blood. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as the chilled, filtered air of the bunker hit her damp skin. Dominic remained by the table. He was staring at the clear plastic tube bridging the severed artery, watching the steady, rhythmic pulse of blood flowing through it. He looked up, his icy grey eyes locking onto the green line of the monitor. The numbers were stabilizing. Blood pressure was climbing out of the danger zone. He slowly pulled the blue gloves from his massive hands, dropping them onto the metal tray. He didn't speak. He walked over to the stainless steel sink, turned the water on scalding hot, and scrubbed his hands with harsh orange soap. The water ran pink, then clear. Claire watched him, her mind racing. The immediate crisis was over, which meant the reality of her situation was about to set in. She was a recently fired, completely broke nurse, standing in a secret mob hospital, having just saved the brother of a man who looked like he killed people for a living. Dominic dried his hands on a sterile towel and turned to face her. The brutal, frantic energy that had possessed him in the SUV was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating stillness. He leaned against the metal counter, crossing his arms over his ruined white shirt. "Where did you learn to do a vascular shunt with IV tubing?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "I spent 6 years working the Friday night trauma shift on the south side," Claire said, leaning against the cold wall to keep her legs from giving out. "You see a lot of gunshot wounds. When the vascular surgeons are all tied up in the OR, you learn how to improvise so the patient doesn't bleed out in the hallway." "You're a nurse." "I was," Claire corrected, her voice flat. "Until about 3 hours ago." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly, processing the information. He looked at her ruined, blood-soaked clothes, the wet hair plastered to her skull, the dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. She looked like a casualty of war, yet she had commanded the room with absolute authority. "Why were you fired?" he asked. "I saved a patient," Claire said bitterly, looking away from him, staring at the concrete floor. "The attending physician froze during a tension pneumothorax. I bypassed him and decompressed the chest myself. It's against protocol. The hospital decided I was a liability." Dominic let out a short, humorless breath. "They fired you for doing your job." "They fired me for making a doctor look incompetent," Claire said. She pushed off the wall, forcing herself to stand straight. She wasn't going to cower in front of him. "I stabilized him. The shunt will hold for a few hours, but he needs a massive dose of broad-spectrum antibiotics, and he still needs a real surgeon to graft that artery. If you don't get one down here by morning, he loses the leg. By tomorrow night, he loses his life to sepsis." Dominic's jaw clenched, the muscle ticking under his skin. "The surgeon I pay to be on call isn't answering. His tracker is offline. He's gone." "Then take him to a real hospital," Claire said. "I can't," Dominic said, his voice dropping, the dangerous edge returning. "The people who hit Tommy tonight aren't street thugs. They're organized. They knew exactly where he was going to be, and they knew his security detail was light. They bought my doctor to ensure that if they didn't kill him in the street, he'd bleed out waiting for help." Claire felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "You have a leak." "I have a rat," Dominic corrected softly. "And until I find out who it is, I can't trust my own people. And I definitely can't trust a public ER. If I walk him into St. Jude's, a hit squad will be walking in 10 minutes later." He pushed off the counter and closed the distance between them. Claire didn't back away, though her instincts screamed at her to put distance between herself and the violence rolling off him. He stopped 2 feet away, towering over her. "You're not leaving, Claire," Dominic said. It wasn't a threat this time. It was a statement of absolute fact. "I can't let you walk out that door, not with what you know, and not with him in that bed." "You can't keep me here," Claire said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. "I can," he replied smoothly. "But I'd rather hire you." Claire blinked, thrown entirely off balance. "Excuse me, my doctor is gone. My brother is critical. I need someone to keep him alive until I can fly a trusted surgeon in from New York tomorrow," Dominic said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You don't have a job. You don't have money. And you clearly don't flinch when there's blood on the floor." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills, bound by a simple paper band. He tossed it onto the metal tray next to the biohazard bin. It landed with a heavy thud. "That's $20,000, Dominic said. "For one night of work. You keep his vitals stable, you pump him full of whatever antibiotics you need, and you keep him breathing until my guy gets here. After that, you walk out the door, and we never saw each other." Claire stared at the money. It was more than she made in 6 months of grueling, soul-crushing shifts at the hospital. It was enough to fix her car, pay her rent, and disappear for a while. She looked from the cash to the man bleeding on the table, and finally up to the mob boss standing in front of her. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling realization. She was already in too deep. "I need dry scrubs," Claire said, "and coffee. Black." 10 minutes later, a heavy metal door at the back of the surgical suite opened. A man Claire hadn't seen before. Short, built like a fire hydrant, and sporting a freshly bruised jaw, stepped inside. He didn't make eye contact. He set a stack of folded navy blue scrubs and a steaming styrofoam cup on a sterile rolling tray, then backed out of the room like he was leaving an offering for a volatile god. Claire took the coffee. It was pitch black, burned, and tasted like battery acid. It was the best thing she had ever drank. She retreated to a small alcove housing the autoclave and stripped off her ruined clothes. Her denim jacket was stiff with drying blood. Her white shirt was a lost cause. She wiped the sticky crimson residue from her neck and collarbones with harsh antiseptic wipes, the alcohol stinging the micro-abrasions on her skin. The scrubs were at least 2 sizes too big. She rolled the waistband down 3 times and tied the drawstring tight, cuffing the pant legs so she wouldn't trip over them. She splashed cold water on her face, stared at her exhausted reflection in the polished steel of a cabinet door, and walked back to her patient. Tommy was still under. His chest rose and fell in a shallow mechanical rhythm. The clear plastic shunt pulsed steadily against the raw muscle of his thigh. Dominic was sitting on a stainless steel stool in the corner of the room. He had changed his ruined shirt for a black Henley that stretched tight across his shoulders. A tablet rested on his knees, his thumbs moving rapidly across the screen, but his eyes kept flicking to the heart monitor. "I need access to your pharmacy," Claire said, breaking the heavy silence. "He needs broad-spectrum IV antibiotics, cefazolin or Rocephin, and I need pain management, fentanyl or Dilaudid. When he wakes up, the pain from that leg is going to spike his heart rate, and I don't want him blowing a clot." Dominic stood up. He walked over to a heavy steel cabinet, set flush into the concrete wall. He punched a 6-digit code into the electronic keypad. A heavy click echoed through the room, and he pulled the door open. Claire walked it over. It wasn't a standard lockbox. It was a fully stocked narcotic vault. Rows of little glass vials lined the shelves, meticulously organized. "Take what you need," Dominic said. Claire grabbed a vial of Rocephin, a saline flush, and 2 small ampules of Dilaudid. She logged the medications purely out of habit, her brain still running on hospital protocol, before she caught herself and dropped the pen. There was no chart here, no billing department. She moved back to Tommy, drawing the clear liquid into a syringe and pushing it into the IV port. "How long until your guy gets here?" she asked, checking Tommy's pupil response with a penlight. 7 hours, Dominic said. He leaned against the wall, watching her hands. "He's flying out of Teterboro on a private charter. Wheels down at midway around 4 in the morning. He brings his own surgical team. 7 hours is a long time for a piece of IV tubing to do the job of a femoral artery," Claire said bluntly. "He's lost a lot of blood. The Ringer's solution is keeping his volume up, but he's running on fumes. He needs whole blood. We have O negative in the cooler." "It's not that simple," Claire sighed, dragging a stool to the side of the table and sitting down. Her legs were finally giving out. "I can hang a bag of O-neg, but without knowing his exact type and cross-matching it, there's a risk of a hemolytic reaction. His body could attack the donor blood. It's a last resort. If his pressure drops, then we roll the dice," Claire said. She leaned her head back against the cold tile of the wall. "But right now, he's stable. So we wait." The room fell quiet again. It wasn't the frantic, screaming silence of an emergency room waiting for the next ambulance. It was heavy, insular. The bunker felt disconnected from the rest of the world. Above them, the Chicago rain was likely still washing the blood off the pavement. Down here, time had stopped. Dominic watched her. He didn't have the restless, pacing energy she usually saw in family members of trauma victims. He was terrifyingly still. "You didn't run," he stated. It wasn't a question. Claire kept her eyes closed. "Run where? You have armed men outside the door. I don't know where I am. And I'm pretty sure stepping out into the alley with 20 grand in mob money isn't going to end well for me. You could have refused to work on him in the car. He was bleeding to death." "People die every day," Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. Claire opened her eyes. She looked at the man sitting across from her. He was brutal, calculating, and unapologetic. But he was also sitting in a concrete bunker, watching his brother breathe like it was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. "Not in front of me," Claire said softly. "Not if I can stop it." Dominic's jaw shifted. He looked away, his eyes dropping to the floor. "My father built this room 10 years ago. Said a hospital was just a prison with better lighting. If you get shot in our line of work, walking into an ER is a death sentence. The cops chain you to the bed, and your enemies know exactly where you sleep. So you built a trauma center in a basement. It kept him alive for a decade," Dominic said, "until it didn't. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The violence of his world was written into the scars on his knuckles and the coldness in his eyes." "Get some sleep," Dominic ordered, gesturing to a small cot in the corner of the room. "I'll watch the monitor. If the numbers drop, I'll wake you." Claire looked at the cot. It looked incredibly inviting, but she shook her head. "I don't sleep on shift. If that shunt slips, he bleeds out in 90 seconds. I'm staying right here." Dominic stared at her for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he nodded. Respect was a hard currency in his world, and Claire had just earned a massive deposit. By 3 a.m., the bunker felt like a tomb. The initial adrenaline crash had passed, leaving Claire in a state of hyper-vigilant exhaustion. She sat on the metal stool, her elbows resting on her knees, watching the steady, hypnotic rhythm of Tommy's chest. His fever had spiked around midnight, a natural inflammatory response to the massive tissue trauma, but Claire had managed it with IV Tylenol and cold packs packed around his groin and armpits. The plastic shunt was holding, It was a minor miracle of plumbing and sheer stubbornness. Dominic was still awake. He had moved to a steel desk in the corner, a laptop open in front of him. The harsh blue light of the screen cast sharp shadows across his face. He was quietly murmuring into a burner phone, his voice a low, lethal rumble that didn't carry across the room. He hung up and closed the laptop. The quiet snap echoed loudly. Claire looked up. "Did you find your rat?" Dominic didn't look surprised by her bluntness. He walked over, bringing a fresh bottle of water. He unscrewed the cap and handed it to her. "We narrowed it down," he said. "Only 4 people knew Tommy's route tonight. 2 of them are dead in the front seat of that SUV. And the other 2? "One is the head of my security," Dominic said, leaning his hip against the metal counter. "The other is his second in command. They're currently being questioned in a warehouse on the south side." Claire took a long drink of the water. Questioned. Aggressively. She didn't flinch. 9 years in the ER had stripped away her illusions about how the city operated when the sun went down. She had treated the aftermath of those questionings. Broken femurs, crushed hands, burns. She knew the reality of the man standing in front of her. "You're remarkably calm for a woman who got hijacked at gunpoint," Dominic observed. "I got fired for saving a life today," Claire said, her voice dry, devoid of self-pity. "My checking account is overdrawn. My car is dead. And my landlord is probably going to evict me next week. Getting kidnapped by a crime syndicate honestly just feels like the logical conclusion to my Tuesday." Dominic let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh. It changed his face entirely, erasing the lethal edge and revealing something sharply human beneath it. He reached out. Claire stiffened, but she didn't pull away. Dominic's large, calloused hand brushed against the side of her neck. His thumb traced a faint, purpling bruise just below her collarbone. A parting gift from being thrown against the reinforced glass of the speeding SUV. His touch was terrifyingly gentle. The contrast between the violence he was capable of and the care in his fingertips sent a sudden, jarring shock down Claire's spine. "I'm sorry," he said softly. Claire swallowed hard. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "For kidnapping me? Or for the bruise?" "Both." His hand dropped away, the absence of his heat leaving a cold patch on her skin. "When Tommy got hit, the protocol went out the window. I didn't care who I had to break to fix him. I just saw a nurse." "I'm not broken," Claire said quietly. "No," Dominic agreed, his pale eyes tracking her face. "You're not." A sharp, synthetic beep interrupted the quiet. Claire spun around, her professional instincts overriding the strange tension instantly. It wasn't the heart monitor, it was the IV pump. The bag of Ringer's solution had run dry. She stood up, shaking off the lingering heat of Dominic's touch, and walked over to the cabinet to grab another bag. As she spiked the new IV bag and hung it on the metal pole, a different sound cut through the bunker. It was low, guttural, and vibrating through the concrete walls. A muffled siren. Dominic stiffened. He turned his head toward the heavy double doors, his hand instinctively dropping to the weapon at his ribs. "What is that?" Claire asked, freezing with her hand on the IV roller clamp. "Perimeter alarm," Dominic said. The softness was entirely gone from his voice. He was the boss again. Cold, calculating, deadly. He pulled the heavy Glock from his holster, checking the chamber with a sharp, metallic clack. He walked swiftly to a panel on the wall and hit a switch. A bank of security monitors above the desk flickered to life, showing black and white feeds of the alleyway, the garage, and the street outside. The feed for the alleyway was static. Someone had cut the camera. The feed for the garage showed 3 unmarked, dark sedans idling just outside the corrugated steel door. Men in tactical gear were piling out. They weren't wearing police badges. They were carrying heavy suppressed rifles. "The surgeon?" Claire asked, her heart slamming against her ribs. "No," Dominic said, stepping away from the monitors. He looked at Claire, his expression grim. "The rat gave up the location. It's a hit squad." He walked over to a metal drawer, pulled out a smaller, compact handgun, and slapped a magazine into the grip. He held it out to her, handle first. Claire stared at the weapon. Her hands, which had fearlessly plunged into a ruined leg to pinch a bleeding artery, refused to move. "I heal people," Claire said, her voice shaking. "I don't shoot them." "They aren't here to check your resume, Claire," Dominic said brutally. He grabbed her hand and shoved the cold, heavy metal into her palm. "They're here to finish what they started, and they aren't going to leave witnesses." The heavy steel door of the garage outside echoed with a massive, booming impact. They were breaching the compound. Dominic stepped between Claire and the double doors leading out to the garage. He raised his weapon. "Stay behind the table. Keep him breathing." Another deafening boom rattled the concrete floor. Dust drifted down from the acoustic ceiling tiles, coating the sterile stainless steel trays in a fine layer of grey grit. Out in the garage, the shooting started. It wasn't the chaotic, sustained spray of Hollywood action movies. It was disciplined, tactical. 3-round bursts that snapped through the heavy doors like breaking lumber. The bunker's reinforced walls muffled the noise, but the vibration traveled straight up Claire's spine, vibrating in her teeth. "Get down!" Dominic barked. Claire didn't hesitate. She dropped into a crouch, pressing her back against the thick pedestal of the operating table. She kept one hand clamped around the grip of the compact pistol, the safety digging sharply into her palm. Her other hand reached up, blindly checking the tension on Tommy's IV line. The clear fluid kept dripping. "Good. Stay stable." The heavy double doors of the surgical suite shuddered violently. Someone was kicking the locking mechanism. Dominic stood 10 feet away, positioned behind a reinforced structural pillar. He didn't look frantic. He looked like a man settling into his natural environment. He raised his heavy weapon, aiming directly at the center seam of the doors, his breathing perfectly even. The lock gave way with a screech of tearing metal. The doors burst inward. 2 men in dark tactical gear spilled into the room, suppressed assault rifles raised to their shoulders. Dominic fired before they could fully clear the threshold. The noise in the enclosed space was catastrophic. It felt like a physical blow to Claire's eardrums. She squeezed her eyes shut, clapping her hands over her ears, the small handgun trapped awkwardly against her cheek. One of the tactical men dropped instantly, his body sliding across the polished epoxy floor. The second man staggered back, firing wildly in response. A spray of bullets chewed into the ceiling, raining plaster, dust, and sparks down onto the surgical table. The overhead surgical lamps shattered in a shower of glass. The room plunged into darkness for a split second before the backup generator kicked in. The emergency lighting bathed the bloody suite in a harsh, crimson glow. "Claire, the monitor!" Dominic yelled over the ringing in her ears. She scrambled up to her knees. A stray bullet had shattered the plastic casing of the ECG machine. The screen was dead. The rhythmic, reassuring beep was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced her clinical detachment. Without the monitor, she was flying blind. She didn't know if Tommy was crashing. She dropped the gun onto the floor and reached over the edge of the table. She pressed 2 fingers firmly to Tommy's carotid artery. Thump, 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 fast but steady. He was still with them. Footsteps slapped against the floorboards outside. More men were flooding the garage. Dominic ejected his spent magazine, slapped a fresh one into the grip, and stepped out from cover. He moved with brutal efficiency, laying down a suppressing fire that forced the attackers back into the bottleneck of the hallway. Then, a shadow detached itself from the alcove near the autoclave. One of the hitmen had slipped through the side door during the initial chaos. He was dressed in black, his face obscured by a ballistic mask. He wasn't aiming at Dominic. He was aiming a pistol directly at Tommy's chest. They were here to finish the job. Claire didn't think. The rational, calculating part of her brain simply shut down, overridden by pure protective instinct. She dropped her hand from Tommy's neck, her fingers wrapping around the grip of the compact pistol she had left on the floor. She raised it. She didn't aim down the sights. She just pointed it at the center of the dark mass standing 3 feet away and squeezed the trigger. The recoil snapped her wrist back violently. The crack of the gunshot was absurdly loud. The man jerked backward, a dark stain blooming instantly on the outer thigh of his tactical pants. He crumpled with a shout of pain, his weapon clattering harmlessly onto the floor. Claire stared at him, her chest heaving, the acrid smell of burnt cordite filling her nose. She had aimed for the leg. A deliberate, surgical strike to immobilize. Even in a gunfight, she was still a nurse. Dominic spun around, his weapon raised, but the immediate threat was already bleeding on the tiles. Before Dominic could finish him, a new sound echoed from the garage. The screech of heavy tires, multiple vehicles braking hard. A voice bellowed over a megaphone, vibrating through the concrete. "Drop the weapons! Perimeter is secured!" Dominic lowered his gun a fraction of an inch, the rigid tension in his shoulders finally dropping. "That's my backup." He walked over to the man writhing on the floor, kicked his weapon out of reach, and pressed a heavy combat boot onto his uninjured knee, pinning him down. The room fell eerily silent, save for the ragged breathing of the wounded hitman. Dominic turned his head, his pale eyes finding Claire in the dim red light. She was still kneeling beside the table, the gun trembling violently in her hands. She looked completely shattered. The adrenaline was rapidly draining away, leaving her pale, cold, and shaking. He stepped away from the hitman, walked over to her, and gently pried the weapon from her stiff fingers. He engaged the safety and set it on a metal tray. "You missed the artery," Dominic said softly, looking at the wounded man on the floor, then back to her. "I wasn't trying to kill him," Claire whispered, her voice cracking. He was going to shoot my patient." Dominic crouched down so he was at eye level with her. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a smear of soot and concrete dust from her cheek. "You just crossed a line, Claire." His voice was heavy with a dangerous promise. "You saved my brother. Twice. You bled for my family. You fought for them." He leaned in, the scent of gunpowder and rain radiating off him. "You don't get to walk away after tonight," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. "And I don't think I'm going to let you." The heavy metal doors swung open again. A team of men in scrub caps and surgical masks rushed in, carrying portable trauma kits. The real surgeon had finally arrived. Claire slumped back against the pedestal, the weight of the night finally crushing her. She was alive. Tommy was alive. But as she looked up at Dominic, standing guard over her in the blood-soaked bunker, she realized her old life at the hospital was dead. A new one, terrifying and absolute, had just begun. Claire survived her first night in the underworld, but pulling that trigger sealed her fate. She's no longer just a fired nurse. She's the mob's most valuable asset, and Dominic is never letting her go. Will she escape this dangerous new life, or will the cold-blooded mafia boss pull her deeper into his violent world? If you enjoyed this intense, grounded mafia romance, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. Drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Claire's shoes?